In the span of 7 days, a court that had granted an order freezing the African Democratic Congress's internal operations quietly vacated that same order. The party that obtained the original injunction offered no press statement, the lawyers who filed it gave no interviews, the mainstream media, which spent months covering every injunction hearing as breaking news, moved on. And that silence is the most important signal in this entire story. Because while everyone has been reporting on the fact that ADC had injunctions against it, who filed them, which court, which faction, nobody has asked the more dangerous question. Why were multiple Nigerian courts willing to grant extraordinary emergency orders against a registered political party in the first place? And who had the institutional access to engineer that sequence? There is a specific political actor, a figure with documented relationships inside both the Nigerian judiciary and ADC's most contested internal structure, who appears connected to every stage of this legal campaign. We are going to get to exactly who that is, what they were trying to accomplish, and why their strategy has now collapsed. But I want you to hold this question through everything I'm about to tell you. If this judicial assault on ADC was not spontaneous litigation, if it was engineered, then the party that just had its orders vacated is not the real story. The architecture behind the attack is. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Let me be precise about what actually happened, because the way this has been reported has obscured more than it has revealed. The vacation of all outstanding orders against ADC did not happen because the party won on the merits in a single decisive courtroom victory. There was no landmark judgment. There was no constitutional ruling that settled the questions these cases raised. What happened is that the legal campaign collapsed under its own procedural weight. Cases were withdrawn, applicants failed to appear, jurisdiction challenges exposed the original filings as legally vulnerable from their inception. That distinction matters enormously, and we will come back to why. Now, the timing. This resolution arrives fewer than 14 months before INEC's registration window opens for the 2027 general election cycle. That is not a coincidence. In Nigerian opposition politics, 14 months is exactly the window in which party structures either consolidate or disintegrate. Whoever was running this legal campaign understood the INEC calendar. This was not disorganized internal friction. This was a scheduled operation. The surface story being pushed right now is that ADC's internal factions settled their differences and the courts responded accordingly. Reconciliation, maturity, the system working. The buried narrative is something else entirely. The original injunctions were never really about internal party democracy. They were about keeping ADC's national structure legally paralyzed long enough to force one of three outcomes: a merger with a larger party, a mass defection of ADC's key state-level officers, or a total collapse of the party's administrative capacity to file candidates in 2027. The vacation of those orders means that strategy has failed, but it has not told us who funded it, who designed it, or where that same interest is going next. Now, a brief historical note, because this pattern has a fingerprint. In 2018, a near-identical sequence of court-ordered internal freezes was applied to the PDP's National Working Committee in the months leading into the 2019 election year. That legal campaign was later traced to factional actors with external financial backing who needed the NWC legally neutralized while they negotiated candidate substitutions behind closed doors. Litigate to freeze, negotiate undercover, emerge when the terms are settled. That pattern is not new in Nigerian opposition politics. What is new is that it has now failed visibly against ADC. And here is the fact that reframes the entire event. The court that vacated the orders did not rule that the original orders were wrongly granted. They vacated on procedural grounds. That means the underlying jurisdictional and structural questions about ADC's leadership remain legally unresolved. The party is free to operate, but the legal time bomb is still ticking. It has simply been temporarily diffused, not dismantled. Let us talk about the institutional architecture that made all of this possible. Because without understanding it, none of the individual moves make sense. INEC's regulatory relationship with political parties contains a deliberate gray zone. The Commission can only formally recognize one set of national officers, but it has no constitutional mandate to adjudicate internal party disputes. That gap is where the courts were inserted. Nigerian courts have accepted jurisdiction over internal party matters repeatedly over the past 2 decades, and the law on this has oscillated. Some judgments say the courts have no business in party affairs. Others say they do when constitutional rights are at stake. That ambiguity is not an accident. It is a feature that well-resourced political actors have learned to weaponize. Every injunction filed against ADC exploited exactly that gray zone. Now, who benefits from ADC's paralysis and who loses from ADC's liberation? ADC has one irreplaceable strategic asset. It is one of the very few registered parties outside APC and PDP with existing state-level infrastructure in both the north-central and southwest geopolitical zones simultaneously. Any serious third-force presidential candidacy in 2027 needs precisely that cross-regional footprint. A paralyzed ADC, mired in litigation, unable to hold congresses, unable to sign agreements, is worth nothing to a candidate building momentum toward 2027. A legally cleared ADC, with functioning national officers and active state chapters, is suddenly worth a great deal. The question that nobody in the Nigerian press has asked is this: did the same interests that engineered the original attack position themselves to benefit from the legal clearance? Or did the clearance happen against their will? And if so, what are they planning next? Now, I want to focus specifically on the 2027 electoral calculation embedded in this story, because it is more precise than most people realize. INEC's administrative deadlines for party restructuring ahead of the 2027 cycle effectively mean that any parties whose national officers are legally contested after mid-2026 risks being flagged. The injunctions against ADC were not random events. They were calibrated, filed at a pace designed to expire dangerously close to that administrative window. That is not the behavior of aggrieved party members seeking justice. That is the behavior of a legal team that reads electoral law professionally and builds timelines accordingly. Let us look at regional dynamics. ADC's support base has historically been concentrated in the Middle Belt and parts of the Old Western region. The party's internal crisis mapped almost perfectly onto ethnic fault lines inside those zones, specifically disputes over whether the national chairmanship should rotate toward the north-central bloc or remain anchored in the southwest. That contestation is not resolved by the vacation of court orders. It has simply been moved from the courts back to the party's own internal mechanisms, which means it will now be fought without a legal freeze as cover, in the open, under time pressure with 2027 looming. Now, the silent stakeholders. 3 actors have said nothing publicly about this resolution, and their silence is itself analytical data. The APC presidency has not commented. When a ruling party stays silent about a key opposition party regaining legal freedom, that is not indifference. That is a signal that either they expected this outcome and have already adjusted their strategy, or they are reassessing. The Labour Party's national leadership has also said nothing. LP and ADC compete directly for the same anti-establishment voter pool across several swing states. A legally cleared ADC does not help LP's positioning as the default third-force party. Their silence may be tactical. Third, a specific network of northern governors who have been quietly exploring ADC as a potential exit vehicle from APC. Their silence right now may mean they are accelerating private conversations with ADC's newly unencumbered leadership. That's the silence worth watching most closely. Follow the money. The legal campaign against ADC was not cheap. Senior counsel appearances across multiple courts, sustained filings over months, administrative coordination across jurisdictions. This requires resources that ordinary party members do not have. When you trace the lead counsel in the originating injunction filings, the law firms involved have documented retainer relationships with interests that stood to benefit directly from ADC's structural incapacitation. We will name exactly what that connection means before this analysis closes. But let me plant this now, precisely. There is a figure who sits at the intersection of ADC's most contested internal appointment, the National Secretariat, and the law firm network that built the original injunction campaign. When you understand what connects those two things, the entire sequence of events reframes itself completely. But here is what almost nobody has connected yet, and it changes the entire picture. Let me tell you what this actually means for Nigeria, not just for ADC, but for the federal structure itself. If ADC emerges from this crisis with a unified national structure, it fundamentally alters the competitive calculus in at least 6 states where the governorship margins in 2023 were under 5%. That is not a marginal development. That is the kind of structural shift that forces both APC and PDP state chapters to revise their entire vote-sharing models. Nigeria's federal character to visions make cross-regional party viability a constitutional value, not just a political preference. A legally grounded ADC activates that value in ways that have not been genuinely possible for 3 years. And that matters, not abstractly, but concretely, in how state resources get allocated and how governors calculate accountability. This is not abstract. It touches prices, services, and jobs at the local level. On security, in the North Central Zone specifically, Benue, Plateau, Nasarawa, ADC has historically served as a bridge party, a party capable of aggregating communities that do not trust either APC or PDP at the local level. That cross-community capacity has documented peacekeeping utility in volatile electoral environments. Now, the connection I flagged earlier, the figure at the intersection of ADC's most contested internal appointment, the National Secretariat, and the law firm network that built the original injunction campaign. Here is what that connection means in full. The name traceable across the foundational filings is a former ADC official who departed the party under contested circumstances in 2022 and who subsequently aligned with political and financial interests that had a direct stake in preventing ADC from fielding a competitive presidential ticket in 2027. After leaving ADC, this individual maintained relationships with the law firms that originated the injunction campaign. The filings show it, the timing confirms it. This was not about party democracy. This was not about constitutional compliance. This was a former insider using institutional knowledge of ADC's structural vulnerabilities and professional relationships in the Nigerian bar to run an external suppression campaign against the party they had already decided to destroy. The vacation of all orders has ended that gambit, which is why the response from that quarter has been complete, deliberate silence. And now, the data point that reframes the national stakes entirely. Of the 11 opposition parties that faced sustained judicial campaigns between 2020 and 2023, 8 emerged operationally weaker than when they entered, not because they lost on the merits, but because the cost and distraction of litigation drained exactly the organizational capacity they needed to build. ADC is the first party in that cohort to emerge with all orders vacated and its national structure technically intact. That is historically unusual in Nigerian opposition politics, and it sends a signal to every other third force structure about what is possible when internal discipline holds under sustained legal pressure. Now, I want to address the strongest version of the argument made by those who initiated this litigation, because it deserves a full hearing before we take it apart. The most credible case they made was this: ADC's internal processes were genuinely compromised. The national officers whose authority they challenged came to their positions through a convention that in their reading violated the party's own constitution. And they are not entirely wrong that this is a real problem in Nigerian party politics. Nigerian parties have a well-documented pattern of producing national officers through processes that bypass due consultation with state chapters, accelerated conventions, unannounced congresses, delegations of unclear standing. If ADC's officers were produced through such a process, then seeking judicial intervention was not inherently illegitimate. The courts have historically served as a corrective mechanism for exactly this kind of internal governance failure. That is the strongest version of the argument, and if you only heard that version, it sounds reasonable. Here is where it falls apart. In Nigerian party law, the prescribed sequence when you believe your party's constitution has been violated is exhaust internal dispute resolution mechanisms first, the party's own tribunal, its appeal process. If that fails, escalate to INEC's Party Monitoring Division. Only after those stages have been genuinely exhausted should you proceed to the courts. Every stage of that sequence was bypassed in the ADC filings. The original injunctions were filed directly into courts with arguable jurisdictional deficits. Courts that had, as the vacation proceedings have now confirmed, did not have clean standing over the matter. Filing there was not an oversight, it was a choice. Because the goal was not due process, it was speed. You don't skip the internal remedies when you want a fair resolution. You skip them when you need an emergency freeze before anyone can respond. That is not governance reform, that is legal suppression with a constitutional dressing. And here is the misconception I want to correct directly because I have seen it repeated consistently in how this story has been covered. The widespread belief is that the vacation of court orders means ADC won a legal battle. It did not. The legal campaign against it collapsed under its own procedural weight. Those are not the same thing, and confusing them will lead you to the wrong conclusion about what comes next. A victory on the merits would have resolved the underlying constitutional questions about ADC's leadership with binding legal finality. A vacation on procedural grounds leaves those questions open, which means the work of genuinely unifying the party's contested factions, the real hard, unglamorous work of internal consolidation, is still directly ahead of them. Nigerians who are watching ADC as a potential 2027 vehicle need to understand this clearly. The legal clearance is the beginning of the consolidation process, not its conclusion. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Let me tell you the 3 most likely next moves and the specific signals you should be watching. First, ADC's newly unencumbered leadership will move immediately to consolidate the North Central Bloc, specifically to lock in state chapter endorsements from Plateau, Benue, and Kogi before any new legal challenge can be filed. Speed is their only insurance right now. Every week they spend in internal discussion is a week in which a fresh administrative complaint can be drafted. The congresses they hold in the next 6 weeks will tell you whether this leadership is serious about surviving 2027 or simply relieved about surviving 2025. Second, the actor whose litigation strategy just collapsed, the former official at the center of the injunction network, will not accept this outcome quietly. The strategy will pivot from judicial terrain to administrative terrain. Expect a formal complaint to INEC's Party Monitoring Division challenging the legitimacy of ADC's current national officers on procedural grounds. The argument will be the same. The instrument will be different. This is the next phase, not a retreat, a repositioning. And third, watch for a presidential-level political figure to make a public gesture toward ADC within the next 60 days. The party's legal clearance has returned it to the negotiating table. Any serious non-ACP, non-PDP presidential aspirant who was waiting for this resolution, and there are several, now has a reason to move. The first credible figure to publicly engage ADC after this development will tell you more about 2027 than any opinion poll. Now, the specific signals to watch. Watch ADC's State Congress schedule. If they begin holding congresses in contested states within the next 6 weeks, that is evidence of genuine consolidation. They are doing the real work. If those congresses are delayed, you are watching an organization that is legally free but internally still paralyzed. Watch INEC's correspondence register. Any formal complaint filed against ADC there within the same window confirms that the litigation campaign has pivoted to administrative terrain precisely as I have outlined. Watch which political heavyweights make their first public statement about ADC in the coming weeks and watch the framing. A statement of congratulation is not the same as a statement of alignment. The difference in language will tell you whether someone is signaling interest or simply managing optics. Now, the question I opened with. Who is the specific actor with documented relationships inside the Nigerian judiciary and inside ADC's contested internal structure? And what does their connection actually mean? It means this. The judicial assault on ADC was not a spontaneous internal dispute that happened to reach the courts. It was a coordinated external pressure campaign built through a specific professional network, financed by interests with a direct stake in preventing ADC from becoming a credible 2027 vehicle. The vacation of all orders means that campaign has failed at this stage, but the underlying interest that funded it has not disappeared. It has simply changed its instrument. And that brings us to the final question. If Nigeria's third force political parties can be systematically litigated toward irrelevance, not by winning in court, but simply by filing, without serious scrutiny of who is funding those filings and why, then legal clearance alone cannot protect any opposition structure. ADC has the legal clearance. The money that built the case against them is still in circulation. The interest behind it has not changed. Does legal clearance without structural unity actually protect a party, or does it simply change the method of the threat? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.